Hey folks, so in this video, we're going to be talking about two schools of thought that sort of stood in opposition to empiricism and positivism. So if you remember from last time, empiricism is a school of philosophy that says direct personal experience is the best way to come to understand the world. So the early scientists at the time were heavily influenced by empiricism as well as positivism, right? The idea that using scientific experiments, using the method of induction, right, where we observe something in the lab and we try to generalize to the greater world about what we see in the lab, are the paths to truth, according to positivism, right? That's the only way that you can be positive or certain about knowledge, according to that school of thought, is by direct observation and using a little bit of logic to link it all together. What we're going to see to this video are two schools that sort of reacted against that. So Romanticism, which focused on feelings rather than observations and believed that intuition was the key to understanding. So empiricism, it's brought us a lot of good things, right? It's brought us a lot of scientific knowledge and understandings about the way diseases are spread and, why the weather patterns are the way they are. But this whole method of empiricism, right? Sorting everything, classifying it into these different groups, and trying to come up with some sort of concrete distinction between those groups also led to some bad things. First of all, the method of induction, what is it doing, right? It's reasoning from a very small set to a large group of people, right? And what does that sound like? It sounds like prejudice. It sounds like racism or xenophobia. Um, so how do you account for all of that, right? How do you make sure that you're not making the same kind of error in your experiment that a racist is when they have one negative encounter with one person from one ethnic group, and then they make a generalization about everybody in that ethnic group? How do you make sure you're not doing the same thing in the lab? Well, Romanticism says, well, don't even try doing that stuff. Just go by intuition. Go by your thoughts, go by your feelings, and go by sort of what your heart tells you. And it's still, in some ways, an influential stream of thought in American society today, right? Well, what do we need to do in order to know what's right? Well, let your heart tell you, let your conscience be your guide. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's influential in America today, as are the thoughts and philosophies of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau was a favorite of the founding fathers, a favorite of the early American revolutionaries. And Rousseau's beliefs were kind of like the ancient Cynic beliefs of Diogenes. Cynic in this case doesn't mean somebody who just hates everything. A cynic was somebody who believed that society had a corrupting influence and that the best way to live a good life was to live free of society's expectations and live free of the dictates of society. Um, so Rousseau believes something quite similar. He believes that living the good life means living the simple life, living the way that the peasants do. He's often associated with this idea called the noble savage, which states that, back in our earliest days, right? So you're thinking about 200,000 years ago when we were all hunter-gatherers, that was the best life, according to Rousseau, that, people got along and people were close to each other and people were noble and would do all kinds of things for other members of the tribe. And it's only civilization that diminishes that nobility. Now, keep in mind, this is in opposition to Thomas Hobbes, who claimed that those hunter-gatherer years of humanity were just pure chaos and murder, right? Kill or be killed, a state of warfare. Life is nasty, brutish, and short during those eras, according to Hobbes. So Rousseau is the complete opposite of it. So you can see why this would have a lot of appeal to the founding fathers, right? If they were coming up with a system of government that did not require a king. Rousseau himself might not have been such a groovy dude. He gave up all of his children, right? He abandoned all of his children, sent them to orphanages. So, maybe he wasn't so great when it comes to actually living a good or virtuous life. but his ideas about how to live a good life were influential on the early Americans, and I think in some respects they're still influential today. Another influential one of the Romantics was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So Goethe is known for writing lots of plays and poetry that were sort of in this Sturm und Drang movement. And Sturm und Drang is just a German phrase that means storm and stress, right? So it is a reaction to empiricism and logic and the sort of cold science that was sort of taking over Europe at the time. So Goethe wrote about people who, they weren't always necessarily morally good, but they always had lots of emotions and lots of feelings, because Goethe felt that, well, there's a little madness inside every one of us. This was during the age when, people might be put in quote unquote madhouses, and even might be, taken out on display for paying customers to see. But Goethe said, each one of us is in our own way a little bit insane. And he tried to capture that in his plays and in his poetry. He also was a scientist as well. So a lot of these people in between, say, like 1400 and 1800, they weren't over specialized the way that a lot of scholars are today, where you only focus on this era of history or you only focus on this kind of science. Goethe, like many thinkers of his day, wrote poetry, also conducted scientific experiments, was trying to be a true Renaissance man, as Kierkegaard is one of the first existentialist thinkers. So existentialism is a form of philosophy that is trying to make sense of an absurd world. So if you're living in a world where science is sort of taking over, if you're living in a world where you're starting to get an inkling of Darwin's ideas of natural selection and realizing that, well, maybe mankind isn't this special creation that we once thought it was. Um, and if that's leading people to start doubting God, or at least doubting Christianity as it was normally understood, I think it's going to lead to a lot of crisis, mental crisis, right? An existential crisis, if you will. So the existentialists were focused on, how do we live a life that has meaning if all of this stuff that humanity has taken for granted might really be meaningless and might really be kind of absurd. So during this time period, it's kind of like with Copernicus and Galileo, right? We used to think that we were the center of the solar system. Copernicus and Galileo came along, showed us that wasn't true. It kind of rattled some people's faith in man's place in the world. Darwin, along about the same time, is coming along and suggesting that humans share common ancestors with modern day chimpanzees. That about 4 million years ago, let's say, chimps went one way and our ancestors went another way. Well, not chimps, but whoever became with chimps' ancestors went one way, our ancestors went another way, and that we're not this special creation, right? We're not this thing that is somehow different from animals. We're just a particular type of animal. So you can see why, like finding out the Earth isn't in the center of the solar system, why Darwin's ideas would create a sense of sort of dread and existential anxiety. Now, Kierkegaard was still focused on Christianity. He called himself a Christian existent, well, he didn't call himself an existentialist, but he was still operating within the philosophical views of Christianity. But he said that, because you can't be sure of this stuff, because, we're thinking about a God in charge of an absurd world, well, then sometimes you might have to take up the banner of religion, even if you might not be completely sure about it, because you need to find something that gives your life meaning. Now, he might not have labeled himself Christian at the time. Kierkegaard is famous for saying, if you label me, you negate me. Now, think about how that stands in opposition to the empiricists, right, who wanted to observe and categorize and label everything, including ethnicities, right? Racism and, well, even the concept of race is a fairly recent one, right? It's only during the early modern period that empiricists begin trying to divide peoples by their recent genetic origin. They might not have known genetics at the time, but they tried to say, here's a group of white people, here's a group of black people, Here's a group of Asian people, right? Or in their parlance, here are the Caucasoids, the Negroids, and the Mongoloids. That's their words, not mine. They were trying to classify people according to these boundaries that once you get into genetics, you find, don't really match up with the way that they viewed race. We'll get more into that later. So Kierkegaard, very influential on humanistic psychology, the idea about using psychology to find meaning in the world. Nietzsche, maybe not so much of an optimist as Kierkegaard, but we can probably lump him in with the Romantics in the sense that he believed that, having passion was a good thing, and that, some of the truth in the world could only be found through, passion. He rejected the premises of Christianity, unlike Kierkegaard. He claimed that Christianity's moralities were the moralities of a slave people, and Nietzsche wanted to find a master morality instead. Nietzsche believed that there were two kinds of moralities. There's master morality, which is dominating and it takes control and it exerts your will upon the world, whereas slave morality is meek and humble and forgives because it has to. That's the way Nietzsche viewed it anyway. Obviously, not a popular guy in Europe, where even when people were beginning to doubt the idea of the Christian God, they still held on to a lot of Christian values and Christian ethics. So one thing where Nietzsche has continued to be influential is his idea that mankind suppressed its animal urges, and that beneath even the most civilized seeming human is, the caveman that's just waiting to have the opportunity to smash his club against somebody who makes him angry. Freud would be influenced by some of Nietzsche's ideas when he developed his idea of the id and the ego and the superego. So we'll see that coming up in a few lectures. So that was one philosophical school that was kind of opposed to. Give me a moment while I close the window. So on one hand, you have people who oppose empiricism because they want to focus on feelings instead. We have another group that is standing in opposition to empiricism because they want to focus on rationalism instead. So instead of going in and doing an inductive reasoning through an experiment and trying to make generalizations that may or may not hold, rationalism focused on deduction, trying to find some kind of universal truth and apply it to specific situations. So you think about it this way: inductive reasoning, I've got a specific situation, I'm trying to make a generalization, trying to make an inference about what happens in general. So in psychology, right, we bring people to a lab, we study them, we get the results, and we're trying to generalize to people in general. That's induction. Deduction is, I already know what the general truth is, so let's apply it to this particular situation. If I know that 2 plus 2 always equals 4, then I can use deductive deductive reasoning to know that if I have 2 pegs here, you can tell we just moved because I got shelf pegs everywhere, and I've got 2 more shelf pegs here, then I must have 4 shelf pegs, right? Going from a universal principle to a specific case of the shelf pegs in my hand. So now the trick here is, how do we find out those universal truths? 2 plus 2 equals 4 might seem, obvious enough, but how do we come to a universal truth about good and evil, or a universal truth about what our duty to society is? Those are the questions that Immanuel Kant struggled with. And Kant is probably one of the biggest figures in rationalism. He put most of his talk on deduction, coming up with universal truths. He will believe that if you could find the universal truth about what's good and what's bad, you could just apply that to any specific moral situation and end up with the best possible outcome. Now, he was influenced by Hume, but came to different conclusions. Remember that Hume, we usually consider one of the empiricists, he said, well, you can believe that this rock is going to fall every time you drop it, but that doesn't guarantee it. Now, Hume's conclusion there was, you got to keep testing and retesting, right? You got to get as much data as you can, and even then you're not going to be sure, but you can kind of approximate the truth. Kant, on the other hand, said, well, because you can only ever approximate the truth through those experiments, why do the experiments at all, right? Why don't we just focus on rationally understanding what the truth is? So he preferred logic over direct experience, Now, Kant also made this distinction between noumena and phenomena. So noumena is the external world, the signals that are trying to reach our brain. Phenomena is the internal world, right? It's what our brain does with those signals. So according to Kant, we're never directly experiencing the world. We're only indirectly experiencing it through our senses. So if I put my hand on the screen here, I have the sensation of what it feels like, but that's really my brain creating it based on the external reality. It's not the external reality itself. Just like when I look around the room, I feel like I'm getting a smooth, unbroken image, but most of that is my brain filling in what it expects to already be there. That's why we can walk around and look for our keys and look and look and look, and we can't find them, and then it turns out they were on the table the whole time because our brain just sort of glossed over it. So whether or not you agree with Kant's rationalism, this idea becomes very influential in psychology. The idea that our brains are not perfect processors of reality. And we'll see how that comes to influence 20th century thinking about psychology as well. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover about the responses to empiricism. Next time, we're going to look at some of the physiological influences on psychology. So things like Phineas Gage, you might remember him, the guy who got the railroad camper through his head. We're going to talk about some of the early experiments on neurology, like Luigi Galvani and Hermann Helmholtz. And we'll also talk about some of the attempts that didn't quite work out, like phrenology, for example. And that's what we'll pick up next time.